I recently posted a video talking about a Monette mouthpiece for the very first time on the channel, and if you want to see that video, it'll be up there in the card. But the reason I bring it up is because the rim on that Monette mouthpiece was based on that of a New York-era Bach 3C, and it made me realize after posting that I haven't actually discussed any Bach New York pieces on the channel. I have several which I would like to talk about, but the impetus for one in particular came swiftly as I sold it on eBay after mere hours of having put it up. And so before I go and ship it off, I think we should probably get this video cranked out. Let's get started. So in the spotlight today we have this Vincent Bach Corp New York 6C. You'll see a very large size stamp there. I would hazard a guess of this being either from the late 20s or the 30s. I think by the 40s, even though they were still manufacturing in New York, they had a smaller size stamp by that point. And these mouthpieces are a lot more variable than the type of thing that comes off of Bach's assembly line today. Obviously, even today's Bach mouthpieces are not entirely consistent from one to the next, but back in the Mount Vernon and especially New York City days, yeah, there was a lot more variability from piece to piece. This one does feel relatively close internally to what one would expect from a 6C, but has its own quirks. First things first, it has this really flat rim, emblematic of a New York piece. This is definitely flatter than you would see on most modern Bach mouthpieces, unless they're specifically designed to be that way, which there are still some sizes that are. I don't typically play on rims like this, but there are a lot of people who do, and a lot of people will even have New York or Mount Vernon rims duplicated for use on their modern pieces by other brands. And then this inner diameter is, if anything, maybe a tiny bit oversized compared to a modern Bach 6C. Not significantly by any means, but maybe as large as a 5C, just again with this flatter rim that makes it feel a little bit tighter. That's the thing with this type of rim, is this amount of inner edge makes the inner diameter feel effectively a little bit smaller than it is. Then the cup has this really nice bowl shape. There is hardly any V, it's almost all U, so when you go into the cup, it drops down pretty sharply at first, and then slopes in towards the bottom. It's a nice way to get a lot of volume without the cup actually being that deep, and this is certainly not that deep of a cup. It is very much the kind of thing you would expect from a nominal C, and the throat entrance on it is probably a little bit tighter than you would get from a modern Bach. There's not a whole lot of room going into the throat, so you're not going to get a super airy sound out of this mouthpiece necessarily, but it is big enough for a nice, big, bold sort of sound. I got this thing in pretty bad condition and replated it myself. It's not my finest replating job. The rim looks fine, but there are obvious blemishes here. I've done better, but nonetheless, at the very least, it is safe to play on thanks to the rim and cup being fully plated. And I have actually just sold this and I'm about to go ship it off with USPS. Actually, the buyer was one of my favorite eBay sellers. I've bought probably 5 or 6 different mouthpieces from him over the last few years, and this is the 3rd one he's bought from me, so, you know, we scratch each other's back here in the trumpet community. I wanted to take a little trip to my favorite site, the Trumpet Mouthpiece Comparator, because this site actually has some examples of Bach 6Cs that we can consult here. We'll start just with a modern Bach 6C. And we're going to overlay a New York 6C over that. And we'll notice the cups are indeed pretty similar. If anything, the New York is a little bit bowled out, more so than the modern one, the way mine feels to some extent. But we will notice, in fact, where the rim does indeed square in the feel of the mouthpiece a little bit more. We'll notice the outer edge of the rim comes a lot higher up than on the modern 6C. The inner edge is not too different, but I do believe this would make the mouthpiece feel just a little bit more locked in than the modern one. And as expected, we have a case of the throat entrance being a little bit tighter on the New York than on the modern one. The first name that comes to mind when I think of the old Bach 6C is our favorite, Chet Baker. I love Chet, I bet you love Chet, and we all love listening to his lovely, fluffy sound. He actually spent a long time pairing a Mount Vernon era Bach 6C with a Constellation 38B trumpet. Well, guess who just happens to have an old Bach 6C and a 38B trumpet to test out with?
I'll provide a couple of caveats here. First thing, Chet sounded like Chet on anything he played on, and Sam sounds a bit like Sam on anything that Sam plays on, but nonetheless, I do like to emulate the Chet Baker style of sound, and I hope that the effect comes across. But the thing is, this particular 6C is not super Chet prone in terms of tone. It's not quite the Chet sound in my opinion, and I think a lot of it comes down to, once again, the transition between cup and throat. On these New York pieces, it is pretty sharp. You have almost a geometric right angle going into the throat, whereas by the Mount Vernon days, this transition had smoothed out a lot, the way we see on almost all modern Bach mouthpieces, where there is quite a gradual transition from cup to throat. And that does a couple of things in mouthpiece design, but principally among them, I've noticed, is it allows you to get kind of dark and fluffy and airy with it, much more so than a sharper transition from cup to throat. And unfortunately, even though a lot of the time some of these vintage mouthpieces are predisposed to a nice, thick, dark sound, the New York 6C doesn't really get the fluff I would want to in order to play Chet Baker stuff with. It, honest to goodness, did do a pretty good job with just some straight classical, honestly, on my main horn. I was impressed at how thick of a sound it is, but I think that is the 6C's bowl cup coming into play. The 6C in particular is one of Bach's more bowled out Cs. I think the 1, the 2, the 5, and the 6 and the 7 are some of the more bowl-shaped ones, whereas the 1 1/4, the 1 1/2, especially the 3, are a little bit less so. By the time you get down to things like the 8C or the 10 1/2 C, those Cs are substantially shallower and slimmer, and so it's fun to play on these old, really bowl-shaped C cups. And then, of course, if I'm playing on a really old mouthpiece, I'm inclined to test it on my pea-shooter trumpet hanging up on the wall there. That's a Conn Cavalier, and so, of course, I decided to see what sort of a match that would result in. It doesn't really accentuate the pea shooter sound necessarily, because once again, we are dealing with quite a big bowl cup, just about as open as you can get while still calling it a C cup because of just how wide the sides of the cup are. Not necessarily what I would choose if I wanted to emulate Harry James on the daily, but a fairly decent pairing in terms of how the horn played and responded, nonetheless. And what I'll briefly mention about Harry James, hopefully without getting too far off topic for too long, is the fact that he tended to play more on double cup shaped mouthpieces, wherein you have a shallow initial cup, a slightly deeper second cup in the middle of that, and then it transitions to the throat. And the thing with a lot of modern Bach mouthpieces is the transition from cup to throat is so gradual that you almost have a small secondary cup at the bottom. So when you play on a New York Bach that has a very sharp transition right here from cup to throat, you pretty much have the antithesis of the double cup. So in that sense, it's no wonder that I didn't sound anything like Harry James on the pea shooter. And to further that point, take the modern Bach 3C design. It is, first of all, very different from the New York 3C, and second of all, it is just about as tight of a C cup as you can justify still calling a C. It is about on the same level of depth as a Bach 7D, ironically, and not only is it a little bit shallower than a lot of the other C cups, but it also has sides that slope in much quicker to form more of a V shape, and so the top of the cup does not have much room at all, but then it does this very laissez-faire transition into the throat. It's a very slow and wide one, in the sense that you almost have a shallow initial cup and a big double cup on the inside of it. And something like that, honestly, like this Corporation 3C I have from the semi-early Elkhart days, about the 70s, something like that is actually a decent pairing for the Cavalier if I want to sound a little bit more like Harry James than I did with this mouthpiece. But I really do want to keep this video a little bit shorter since it's just a little show and tell piece, not a super involved review, so we'll call it there. Hopefully you came away from this video A little bit more knowledgeable on Bach New York pieces and their design versus modern pieces, and B, just plainly entertained. I really enjoy taking a look at mouthpieces like this every so often on the channel, so I hope you enjoyed as well. Make sure to leave a like and a comment down below if you did. As always, you can find more mouthpiece spotlights in the playlist in the top right corner in the card. And until next time, I appreciate you sticking around. We'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.